Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to everyone who's logging in. We are so glad you're with us for today's Jewish Gen Talk with Dr. Dan Oren. We'll start in about a minute, and as we do every week, please leave a message in the chat. Let us know where you're logging in from. It's always so wonderful to see you and where you are from around the world. So please post in the chat where you're from, and we'll get started in about a minute. So Marsha in San Diego. And Cape Town, South Africa. Sasha, welcome. We have Naomi Cohn in Brooklyn. We have Lemon Grove, California. Springfield. Arnold from Markham, Ontario. Welcome. We have Barry Finkel from Chicago. We have Sylvia from London. Bonnie Burns says hello to Dan. And me too. From JGSLI. Thank you. Billy Stein from Givatayim in Israel. Shelly Polero from Maryland. Welcome. We have New York City, Maidenhead in the United Kingdom, Springfield, Massachusetts, Cleveland, Ohio. Deborah Katz, welcome. We have Gary in Baltimore, welcome. We have Rosalind in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We have Myrna Tech's sister, says hello to Dan from San Francisco. Evan says hello to both of us. Thank you, Evan from Cherry Hill. We have Howdy from Nashville. From Marsha Ramey, welcome. Welcome to everyone who's logging in. We are just about to get started, but let us know in the chat where you're logging in from. It's always so wonderful to see you. We have Sandy from Golden Beach, Florida. Hello. Susan Gesundheit from Boulder, Colorado. And we have Yvonne from Rio de Janeiro. Welcome. Okay. Well, welcome, everybody. We're going to get started for today's Jewish Gen Talk. My name is Avraham, and I am privileged to oversee JewishGen, which is the Jewish Genealogical Research Division of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. If you've never been here, if you can imagine the Statue of Liberty, and we are based right across the water. So wonderful view, and if you're ever in New York City, we'd love to host you and to meet you. Please let me know and be glad to invite you down to the museum. Today's talk is part of our ongoing Jewish Gen Talk series of educational webinars. Dr. Dan Oren is joining us today as our guest speaker, and he will be talking about how schools played a central role in Eastern European Jewish life. This session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, but you are always encouraged to take notes. This will be a very fascinating presentation. If you would like to ask questions, Dr. Oren has graciously made himself available, and we'll try to get to them at the end. Please post your questions in the Q&A. You can access that at the bottom of your screen. Please do not post them in the chat. As we always say, you can use the chat to connect with each other and to discuss things as we go along, but it will be very difficult for us to pull questions out of the chat. So please use the Q&A. Finally, I would mention that presentations like this are publicized via our email list, but also our JewishGen discussion group. And if you are not subscribed, please sign up. It's a wonderful forum to stay connected with what's happening in the Jewish genealogical community. And you can stay aware of programs like this one. Of course, you can communicate with others and ask questions and share research advice. So I encourage you, please, to join our discussion group. A little bit about our speaker today, Dr. Dan Oren. He is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Yale University and President of Friends of Jewish Heritage in Poland. He is the author of The Wedding Photo, A Family History of Searching for Genealogy and the Amazing Lost Stories of Family History. He is also author of Joining the Club, A History of Jews in Yale. He is married to US Hanukkah-stamp artist Jeanette Kuvin Oren, and is grateful to be a parent and a grandparent. So we feel very privileged that Dr. Oren is with us today. And without further ado, I pass it over to Dr. Dan Oren.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today, Avraham. It's a privilege to be with you, to be part of the outstanding Jewish Gen programming that goes on all over the internet every moment of the year and in so many other places throughout. And I'm delighted to have all of you, including some friends and even a daughter online watching today. So I'm wanted to share with you a sort of different kind of genealogical story for so many of us, and I'm as guilty of this as everyone. Genealogy is often about, hunting for what in Yiddish is called yichus, some famous ancestor that we're descended from. And it's always exciting to find that we're, fifth cousin once removed with some great composer or some great artist or actor, or that we're a descendant of some interesting and important rabbi. But this kind of talk today is going to be a little bit different. It's more about taking us back into a world that some of us may have been part of, or our parents or grandparents were part of, a world that's largely lost. And the heroes in today's story are not the professors, they're not the great rabbis, they're not the big industrialists, big business people. The heroes, I hope to convince you, are the ordinary people, especially students, parents, and teachers, and the difference that they have made in Jewish history. So let me go to my first slide. I'll do a share screen, and give me 1 second to do that. There's the PowerPoint, and share the sound. Here goes. Do you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let's try again. Okay.
Yes, now I see it.
All right. So let me start. This is Das Gesl, the Kheyders at the center of East European Jewish life. As with any kind of research, it takes a village, it takes a lot of people, and I'm just listing here a few of the people who either helped me directly or whose writings were critical in coming to this day. The photo that's here is that of my late mother, Rebecca Oren. This is a picture of her as a 9-year-old on her passport that got her out of Poland, actually her mother's passport that got her out of Poland when she was a 9-year-old in 1938. Now, yichus is a funny thing, because yichus, this search for ancestors, it's beautiful, but as one wise person told me, the challenge with yichus is that yichus is like a potato plant. The best part of it is underground. So here, the best part that I'm starting with is an article that my grandfather, Avraham Tzvi Mayzels, who got out of Poland right before the Second World War, he wrote this article in 1957 in volume 5 of the Encyclopaedia Shel Galuyot, a chapter about Lublin. Let me just tell you for a moment about him, so when I quote him, you'll know where he's coming from. He was one of 7 children in a Lublin-based Mayzels family, Lublin in Poland. He was one of 7 children who lived past infancy. There were the 2 oldest made it to Palestine. They made Aliyah from Lublin, Poland, right before the war. 4 siblings were murdered during the Shoah. The youngest, his baby sister, survived Auschwitz and made Aliyah after the war. So what he did, as with many other people, we all know about Yizkor books that were written by communities after the war, most often in Israel, usually in Hebrew or in Yiddish, to try and recapture the lost world so that future generations would know what life was like before then. In addition to the Yizkor books, in the mid-50s, a large group of people got together and published this Encyclopedia of the Diaspora Communities, the Encyclopaedia Shel Galuyot, published in Israel. And my grandfather, this was before I was born, wrote a chapter, which in Hebrew the title was Hasimta, literally the alley, or in Yiddish, Das Gesl. The article was in Hebrew, and after many years later, long after he had died, I came across this article, and my mother, whose Hebrew was better than mine, helped me to translate it into English. And that's much of the source for this presentation, although I draw upon other sources as well. Much of what I'm going to talk about takes place in Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, but I'll also show a little bit of outside of this central area about what the Kheyder was. So here's a photograph from Lublin. And one thing I want to do in this talk, this is not something to take notes on, but I've always found that it's much easier to have an understanding of where our ancestors came from if we can have pictures to accompany them, because words are beautiful, but as the line goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a photograph from before World War II of the city of Lublin. At the center of it is a castle that's still standing to this day, a medieval castle. And surrounding the castle, we can see in this photo from before the war, the whole Jewish district. This was a town, as in many places throughout East Europe, when Jews settled, it was under the protection, literally physically, under the physical and legal protection of the local noble or king or prince, and they lived right next to that king or prince here in Lublin. You can see right next to what had been the prince's castle is what was the Maharshal synagogue, the largest synagogue in Lublin. That, like all of this Jewish community, all of this Jewish community building, no longer stands today. But if you zoom in on one little stretch, one little street in this community, I think you come to what was the heart of the Lublin Jewish community, and I would argue the comparable heart in other Jewish communities throughout Eastern Europe. Let's zoom in on that. And here, this is one street running through here, and you can see here in the middle of this street, it gets so busy, even at a distance. All these buildings are just one on top of each other. And this area was called by the Jewish community the Gesl, the alley. There it is right there. Here, if you took a bird's eye view from Google today, this is a modern version of that same castle. This is where the old synagogue was. All of the Jewish community houses that were around here, you can see, have been replaced by park or parking lot. This, for those of you who know Lublin, is one of the entrances to the old city of Lublin, Brama Grodzka, the famous Grodzka Gate going to Grodzka Street. This is the castle, and here's the parking lot right on top of what had once been the Broadway of Lublin, Shiroka Street, which literally means Broadway. Here's a map from before the war. You can see, and again, in addition to photographs, finding maps, finding this, if you can, cadastral maps, which are wonderful, or if you can't, even just a regular map can often be very helpful to get a physical sense of what was where. So here's that castle, here's the Maharshal synagogue. This is where that parking lot I showed you is Shiroka Street, Broadway. You can see it's a wide street. Here's the Grodzka Street, the entrance to the walled city of Lublin. And then there's another street right behind it. Now let me start to share with you some of what my grandfather had wrote. He began the article by talking about, until the eve of the First World War, there were Jews of Lublin who lived in the environment of a special neighborhood that went by the name the Jewish Quarter. He writes, the walls of the neighborhood had started to crumble quite a few years before that. Now, he was writing in 1957, but he left us a very important statement. The walls of the old Jewish neighborhood had started to crumble quite a few years before that. So today, that whole area is gone. And for many of us who go there, and you can pick any city you want in East Europe and see the destroyed Jewish quarters, it can feel very painful to see the loss of it. But it's also important to realize that it was, to use perhaps a coarse term, it was becoming a slum even before the First World War, and certainly by the time of the Second War. But it was home nonetheless. So what my grandfather wrote, though the walls of the neighborhood had started to crumble quite well before the First World War, only a few Jews opened shop in the Christian neighborhood. The few that did move their place of residence were mainly among the group of the intelligentsia and the degree holders, such as doctors and lawyers and their like. And even then, most of the Jewish doctors remained among their own people in the Jewish quarter. The masses of the Jewish people that dwelt in the Jewish section almost didn't leave its borders. They did not come in contact with their Christian neighbors, and they conducted their affairs and lives following the purity of the tradition. In the cities, except for the intelligentsia and the college-educated, most of the Jews wore their traditional garb, the kapota, and on their head, they wore the Jewish hat, hakova HaYehudi, he wrote in the article. The language of their discourse, and of course that was the men, the language of their discourse was Yiddish. The Shabbat ruled supreme in the Jewish neighborhood. On the eve of Friday night at dusk, as the shamash, the community religious aid, announced that the time of candle lighting was near, all the shops would close automatically, and one and all rushed to their homes to welcome the Shabbat. He also left us an important clue in that statement. You know, today, if you go to Israel, on Friday, Israel, with the exception of some convenience stores and the like, in the Jewish districts, it almost shuts down completely on Friday afternoon around 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. But what here he's telling us is that back in the old country, work on Friday continued almost until dusk time, until candle lighting was near. You know, it was hard to earn a living, and one had to get one's living in the time when they could. My grandfather wrote, in the neighborhood where the Jews lived, they called the streets by special names of their own, without even knowing what the official name was. They lived in their own world. Sometimes it was a literal translation from the Polish, like the street called Podzamcze. This here is shown here, I've highlighted in yellow. Podzamcze, they called Hinternschloss, which is Yiddish for behind the castle. And of course, at the Polish, it means the same thing, behind the castle, but they called it by the Yiddish name. Or they picked, here's another street, Yatezhna Street, which they called Diatka-gas, which meant the street of the butchers. At times, the translation was faulty. Like this street up here, you can see was Ulica Ruska Street, the Russian street. However, for the Jews of the community, they would simply call it Dresha, the evil. I think this is fascinating because here we can see that Russia was not very popular in Lublin 120 years ago, and I can assure you it's not any more popular today. But sometimes there was no relation between the formal name and the name that was used by the Jews. For example, the wide street, Shiroka, they called Yiddengasse, Jewish street. And many of the Jews in Lublin didn't even know that the alley, here it is right here, was actually called in Polish Nadstawna Street, meaning Lake Street. For them, it was simply the alley. And indeed, Nadstawna really is an alley. I showed you the picture before. Here's another map. This is a cadastral map where it has every single house that's numbered, and you can use this from a genealogical point of view. It can be a gold mine to try and look at local records and find out physically where a certain person lived and where their house was. But what you can see on this map here, right here, is this street called, this is the Shiroka Street, the big wide street. And here is Nadstawna Street. And you can see here in this particular area especially, the buildings were cramped on top of each other and you could barely walk through it. That was the alley, Das Gesl. And what my grandfather said was that it is about this alley in which every Jewish child first made his inroads in the study of Torah that I would like to tell. The alley was located in the heart of Jewish Lublin and was not considered among the big streets. As its name indicates, it was just an alley. All the boys and the girls, this was an important statement he told us in that article from 1957, because girls were also taught in the Kheyders. All the boys and girls were brought to the alley from the age of 3 in order to learn the Aleph Bet, alphabet, from the teachers. This photo, which actually accompanied my grandfather's article in the 1957 Encyclopaedia Shel Galuyot, was originally published in the Yiddish paper out of New York, The Forwards. It's a photo by Alter Kachizne, and it's in the YIVO collection. And you can see this is from a Lublin yeshiva. I'll show some other, not yeshiva, Kheyder. I'll show you some other Kheyder photos from other towns later. And you can see this is a boys' Kheyder, obviously, from the people who are there. And 4 of the boys are very interested in the photographer. 1 doesn't seem interested in much of anything. And the Malamed wants them instead to be interested in their teaching. So the Hebrew word is Kheyder, Yiddish word Kheyder, and it literally means room. This was the most widely accepted and widespread elementary educational framework among East European Jewry since the Middle Ages. Study in Kheyder was considered a core part of the process of raising and socializing a Jewish child, including the inculcation of Jewish religious and cultural values through imparting basic knowledge of the cardinal sources, Torah, and it didn't stop with Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, and also the liturgy. Pupils spent the whole day in Kheyder, beginning with morning prayers, followed by study of various subjects and ending with evening prayers. Both boys and girls studied in many Kheyders, either together or separately. Here's a photo from the town of Brud, Poland, of boys in a Kheyder. Here from the town of Waszkarzew, Poland. By the way, this is where Waszkarzew, well, actually, this was where Brud was in Poland, if you're looking at it. Here from the town of Waszkarzew, Poland, about 1925, by the same photographer who took so many pictures for the forwards, Alter Kaczynski. This is a girls' Kheyder. Waszkarzew is here southeast of Warsaw on the way to Lublin. Here from the town of Bogoria, Poland, from 1930, from the book Image Before My Eyes by Dobrzyński and Barbara Kirschenblatt. And here is a group in the Kheyder. Interestingly, this Kheyder was supported because money was short. It's expensive to do good teaching. This Kheyder was very fortunate in that there was a Bogoria Descendants Association in Chicago that sent money back to Poland to help fund this Kheyder. I can imagine that this photo was a picture taken to send back to the donors in Chicago to say, look at the good we're doing right here. Here's where Bogoria is on the map. This is Kielce, here's Rzeszów, here's Krakow, northeast of Krakow. Here outside of Poland, here's a photo from a Kheyder in Moldova. Moldova is southwest of Ukraine, opposite the sea from Crimea right here. Now, others have written that until the end of the 18th century, the Kheyder was preserved in its original traditional character. In the 19th and the early 20th centuries, however, substantive changes occurred in the character of the Kheyder, resulting both from the increased involvement of government authorities and from cultural changes that occurred within East European Jewish society itself. Governments tried to raise the level of teachers' qualifications by requiring them to obtain teaching certificates, to include study of the official language of the state in the curriculum, and to synchronize the calendar of the Kheyder with that of the general school system. There were no criteria for acceptance to Kheyder, and no consideration was given to disparities in the intellectual and cognitive abilities of the students. Most Kheyders existed in harsh physical conditions, with unfortunately teachers of limited didactic skills. Disciplinary problems were not always solved in understanding ways. Children with learning difficulty, however, would be assigned to lots of time for free play, going out to play with other kids on the street, or helping the teacher's wife with housework. Corporal punishment, such as with a strap, was also used for discipline. In Tischewitz, in 1950, Stern wrote, quote, "Discipline in the Kheyder was severe, even brutal. The lash was always at work," unquote. It is painful to read his original words from 1950, and I won't do it for you today. Interestingly, he notes that he didn't observe the worst of the physical discipline himself. Rather, it was the elders who told him about it. And he notes that just hearing stories of the discipline used on previous generations was enough to scare the pupils into better behavior. Was this dark side true? I don't have a statistical analysis, and I can't offer one. By the way, here's where Tischewitz is. Here's Lviv in today's Ukraine. It's northwest of Tischewitz. This is an article published by Elchanan Pupko just 3 months ago in the Times of Israel, where he's not writing about pre-war times, he's writing about his own childhood. Here he's referring to a yeshiva, and the article is titled, "The Worst Was Seeing the Teacher Hit My Classmate." He said, debates over educational standards are beside the point. If children live in the shadow of teachers' violence, we cannot remain silent. So it's very hard to know how common this was, but I think we have to assume that at least at some level it was real. My grandfather did not write about this in his article. I can speculate that either it was rare enough in Lublin to be considered an exception to normal, or perhaps in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, when the murder of his parents and four siblings in the Shoah was still raw, it would have been unthinkable to criticize the generations of martyrs in any way. But painful as it is to admit, I think evidence based on the Yizkor books and the like is that not every Kheyder Melamed, every Kheyder teacher was a gifted teacher, and some did use physical discipline that most of us would not tolerate from teachers today. Please note, teacher harshness was not unique and is not unique to Jewish schools. It's not unique to religious schools. We all know about cases of teacher harshness and abuse in all kinds of schools. The simplest thing I could say from an editorial point is that teacher impropriety is something that every parent has a duty to minimize and weed out. Enough on that. Jews are not unique nor notorious for this kind of behavior, but we are not exempt from it. For example, in today's Bobrika, which is in Ukraine today, southeast of Lviv, we read in translation from that Yizkor book, sitting at the head of a long table is the teacher, with a stick in one hand and a pointer in the other. Near him on the side sits a crying child who is looking deeply into a yellow tobacco-stained thick siddur in which the enlarged letters of the Aleph Bet stand out. From a small wooden pushka, the rabbi every now and then takes out a little tobacco between his fingers and stuffs it into his nostrils. The droppings of the tobacco fall down onto his heavy whiskers. His long white beard is almost always shaking. His sharp eyes dart here and there, and he hollers at a child who is fighting with another not far from him. With his large pointer, he gives the child a jab every now and then. A child sits crying near him, and he orders him to look carefully at what the rabbi is showing him in the siddur. Look, you little goy, look good, look good. Do you see what an aleph is? It's a crooked little stick with two little feet, one on top and one from the bottom. Say it after me. Aleph, aleph, aleph. And what do you see under the aleph? A little line, in the middle of which is a little foot. This is a kametz, and together it makes aleph ah. And a whole row of children on the bench learn this way. Kametz aleph ah, ah, ah. In Tishavitz, Yechiel Stern in 1950 recalled the process for teaching the names of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. He recalled the Melamed, the teacher, trying to associate each letter with something the children would understand. The Aleph, he was compared to a water carrier with two buckets. In most of our modern world today, this would be an unthinkable sight. Most of us are fortunate to have running water, and it just comes into the house from a faucet, or the apartment from a faucet. But this is the way water used to be delivered, through a water carrier. And so the students, the pupils, would learn to associate this man carrying the two buckets of water, who was part of their everyday life. This way they would remember he was an Aleph. He was the letter Aleph. Modernization also had a decisive influence on the Kheyders. The increase in the number of students whose parents or who themselves preferred study in either Jewish secular schools or public schools to a Kheyder, there was a steadily increasing tendency among Jewish youth, both male and female, to pursue higher education. And there was a penetration of socialist and nationalist ideologies into Jewish circles that caused a significant shrinkage in the number of Kheyders. On top of that, there were progressives and Zionist Kheyders that emerged as well. Nevertheless, in conservative circles such as Hasidic society, the Kheyder remained a central component in the Jewish educational system. Kheyders were generally divided into three levels, although other systems of division were also known, for example, in Galicia. At the first level, it was the toddler's Kheyder, the Kheyder-dardek, or the Kheyder-ibuvia. It was usually dedicated to the study of the Hebrew alphabet and to develop the most basic reading skills in the Siddur, the prayer book, the 5 books of Moses, and in the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch's Aramaic translation, the Targum Onkelos. Writing was not taught in most Kheyders until the end of the 19th century. The second level of Kheyder was called the Kheyder Chumash. Their pupils studied the 5 books of Moses more intensively, along with Rashi's commentary, and with the aid of sections of the weekly Torah readings translated from Hebrew into Yiddish, the language at home. In this Kheyder, certain chapters from the early prophets were also studied, and the pupils began to make an acquaintance with the Babylonian Talmud. Pretty impressive for kids. In the third level, the Kheyder Gemara selected chapters of the Babylonian Talmud with Rashi's commentary, and the writings of the Tosafos were studied in greater depth. The Kheyder mirrored the socioeconomic structure of the community. The wealthiest families kept children at home for private tutoring. The next class would go to private Kheyders in tutors' homes. Orphans or children of poor families who were unable to pay the normal tuition fees studied in a Talmud Torah. And most communities had a Talmud Torah society that was responsible for raising funds to run this institution. In communities that were too small for their own separate Talmud Torah school, the Talmud Torah Association would pay the Melamed to teach the poor students alongside those from the wealthier homes. Here's a photo, modern times, taken just a week or two ago in the Polish city of Orla. This is the surviving Great Synagogue, a picture of the exterior. Here, a picture of the interior. You can see it was once a place of quite great grandeur. And here, going back to the same town, and this was a small Polish city, this is a photo from pre-war of Orla's poor children of the Talmud Torah examined by the rabbi and the teachers. Here's an outdoor photo of the students. Tests by the teacher or the rabbi or the Melamed were typically on Friday. And on Shabbat, the children would present what they had learned either to their father or a learned member of the community. Nevertheless, not everyone who completed the first or second levels was promoted into a higher level. Sometimes kids would have intellectual or cognitive limitations. Sometimes the family didn't have the money to go beyond. That said, even from the most basic levels, most students did acquire basic Hebrew reading skills and some familiarity with biblical stories and the Talmud. In general, even those who reached the third level and completed their studies at the age of 12 or 13, and relatively few, those with a high intellectual potential, went on to study in a yeshiva. So it was not that most everyone went and became a yeshiva bucher, but those who had the potential did. We're fortunate to have a few surviving glimpses of the pre-Shoah Kheyder, some of which you've seen already. Here's another one. This is a famous photo, but also by the same Alter Kaczynski for the forwards. This is the famous Binyamin Hirsch, who was called Binyamin Hirsch the Beard. He was from the town of Biała-Bielec, which is southwest of Krakow. This photo was taken in the mid-1920s. The photographer's inscription reads, "This is the longest beard in Biała, which the students have more than once nailed to the table while he dozed off. That's why he has such wonderful, sad eyes." Here's a photo from the YIVO website showing a Kheyder in Warsaw in 1917. So what my grandfather wrote, at the toddler's Kheyder, the little ones from ages 3 studied the shape and the form of the letters. And when they reached the age of 5, they graduated to learning Chumash. And after 2 years there, they proceeded to learn Gemara, the rabbinical commentary in the Mishnah, in order to acquire the knowledge used by the Tosafos, the medieval rabbis. The teachers not only taught there, but they also lived there with their families. The instructors divided the building in such a manner that the toddlers instructors, when it was on a multi-story building in the alley, the toddlers instructors used the ground floor for the comfort and security of the very young. After all, it's not easy to climb stairs and there's a danger of falling. The number of the children with the instructors was unlimited. They took in as many as they could. They needed the money. This was their bread and butter. Even the dates for admission to these schools was not determined. Only whenever the child reached the age of 3, the parents would enroll him or her into a Kheyder, so new children would be joining almost daily. Each enrollment and first day of a child was accompanied by a party for the children, I mean, it really was intended to be fun. We know about putting honey on the first page that the children would read when they study the Torah. But at that first day party, the mother would carry the child in her arms. And if she was young, even grandmother would join in the party. And all would partake of the custom where mother would offer candies for all the children of the Kheyder. In the lower grades, there were usually 2 teaching assistants who would help the instructor. The older one would help in teaching and would receive part of his salary from the instructor himself and part from the parents. In most cases, it was a young scholar who actually had the intention of himself becoming an instructor and would assume full responsibility when the head instructor would retire. The second assistant was a young man whose duty was to bring the children to the Kheyder and take them back home at the end of each day. In the winter, when the slanted bridges over the river were covered with ice from spilled water from the buckets of those water bearers I showed you, it would freeze and the crossings would become dangerous for the children. So then the young man assistant would carry them one by one on his shoulders and would bring them to the other side of the river. And again, here, the value of comparing written text with photographs can be so meaningful. Here's the close-up of that photo I showed you of Lublin. So here was that street called the alley. And if you look closely at the photo here, this is the alley. Here, right at the end of the alley is that slanted bridge over the river. So you can see that what we see in words can all of a sudden become palpable. From the Grodzka Gate organization, one can get a close-up picture of that actual bridge. And here it is, that same bridge we saw from above, photo from about 1939. Viktor Zyukovsky is thought to be the photographer. It's in the Brahma-Grodzka collection. And you can see here some Jewish men on the bridge, some children. Here looks like somebody's filling up a pail of water right there. But this bridge would become slippery as ice and very dangerous. So this was the bridge where kids who lived on this side of the town would be carried across the bridge by the assistants. The young men who were the assistants would get meals at the children's parents, each day eating at a different home. When Hanukkah time would come, we've just been through Hanukkah, these young helpers would provide the children with dreidels. At Purim time, they would get from the helpers groggers, noisemakers. At Simchat Torah, they would get flags. And in return, the helpers would receive tips and payments from the parents. At Purim, these helpers served as messengers of Mishloach Manot, food gifts from the instructors to the parents and from the parents to the instructors. This was the way those assistants made their living. The helpers also taught the blessings for different kinds of food and for natural phenomena. If a child saw lightning and then heard thunder, she would have learned in Kheyder which blessing to say. And I'll challenge you, how many of us know this? For lightning, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam oseh maaseh bereshit. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who performs the work of creation. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shekocho gvurato malei olam. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, whose power and might fill the world. If a child was given an apple, he would learn what blessing to say before eating it. The toddlers' classes, I should say, were only held during daylight hours. The older children in the Chumash Torah Kheyders would stay later to study in the evenings in winter, and when they would return home, the assistants would have to light their way with torches. Since the system was that the instructors would teach every child personally, it was one-on-one education for the most part, most of the children would play outside and only from time to time would be called into the assistant or the instructor for learning. So it wasn't torture being kept in a room all day. Most of the day actually was filled with playing. The instructors were particularly on guard, though, to make sure that when the inspectors would come to test the children, that there wouldn't be too many children in the room together. Free time for the children that learned from the Chumah teachers was more constricted for these older children, for they were supposed to spend most of the daily hours in the Kheyder. Also, in these Chumash Kheyders, they had teaching assistants who helped the teacher, because in the Chumash Kheyders, the number of students was also unlimited. Every visit of the inspector created a real panic because the teacher did not want to be found to have too many kids in the class. If he heard the inspector was coming, the teacher would hastily stop the lesson, command the children to disperse, and instructed them not to reveal, chas v'shalom, don't say, God forbid, what room they were learning in. He sent them out of the room, excited and fearful. The children would run down the stairs. And it said, not once during this frightened run were any kids injured. In the Kheyder for Chumash, there wasn't a need as much for the junior helpers because the children came and went home by themselves now. And in this Cheder, there were already fixed vacation times, one after Sukkot, during the Hebrew month of Cheshvan, roughly November, and the second after Pesach, the Hebrew month of Iyar, roughly May. During Chol HaMoed of Sukkot and Pesach, the instructors would spend their time recruiting new students for their Cheyders. These times determined their destiny and their income for the next half of the year. The children didn't learn while the teachers visited the homes of the parents. One could see in the alley in vacation time how the Chumash teachers and the toddlers would walk the streets together and would negotiate which instructor would receive which children from the previous year. The administrators of the toddler Kheyders advised directly to the parents about who were the best Chumash teachers and naturally what they expected to be paid. After the Torah Kheyders, the children would graduate to the Gemara instructors, the Gemara Melameds, who would teach them Torah and Rashi and begin teaching them the Gemara. Here they learned for 2 years. The instructors of Gemara were not assisted by teaching assistants. The number of children here would be limited, and every father typically would take a personal interest in the teacher and ask about the number of students in the class. The maximum that was acceptable in those days was 12 children in a class, yet the teachers always took in an extra 2 or 3. And I'm sure, though, that teachers had reputations and that those with the best reputations received the highest paying parents. So these were the 3 types of the Kheyders that were found in Dos Gesl in the alley. Instructors on a higher echelon than Gemara and Tosafot were to be found all over in a big city, but always with a limited number of children. I mentioned celebrations. Well, every Kheyder had its own celebrations and parties beyond those that were shared by all. As was said earlier, some of the mothers of the children in the toddler Kheyders would bring candies for the first day of learning. The biggest party would take place when the child would start learning Chumash. This celebration would take place on a Shabbat, when the child would reach the age of 5, to fulfill the saying from Pirkei Avot, Ben Chamesh Shanim Lamikra, at the age of 5 to study the Bible. This party was called the beginning of the Chumash party. The anticipation for the celebration was great. The preparations by the parents and the child were made over a long period of time. The child would learn the first sentence of the Vayikra, the Leviticus Torah portion by heart, to be prepared for questions from the greeters. These were children that the other children in the class that the teacher had taught to ask questions from the biblical book of Leviticus. So it was being challenged by your peers in the class. And on the appointed Shabbat for the celebration in the afternoon hours, invited guests gathered to hear from the mouth of the child a drasha, a lesson inspired by the Chumash. Also present were the teacher, the head of the Kheyder, and a group of children from the Kheyder. The teacher wouldn't bring all the children from the Kheyder because he didn't want the numbers to be too large. But for each celebration, he brought different children. The young honoree would stand on a table, dressed in a special kapota, a coat, maybe looking like these young men from today, a special kapota made from glossy silk or satin with a silk belt and a silk hat, looking like a young chassid. Even if he wasn't a chassid, for that day, he would get dressed up that way. The children greeters stood in front of him and started a dialogue between them. They posed questions to the young Bachur HaChumash, the student of the Torah, who had to answer them. At the end of the discourse, candies were thrown above the head of the honoree, and the rest of the children at the celebration would receive little candy bags, and the greeters, as a reward, would receive a double portion, 2 bags, one of gold color, the other of silver color. Beyond that stage, these kind of parties didn't occur. Instead, there was a festive meal at the time that the children completed their winter studies in the evenings before the holiday of Pesach. Each child brought with them to the party a few small coins to give to charity, and the rabbi's wife would typically prepare a meal with wine and cake at the Cheder for Torah. At the Kheyders for Gemara, they would prepare platters on a long table with fish and meat. A general celebration attended by all the Kheyders without exception took place on Lag BaOmer. A driver would travel with the children for a trip outside the city. In Lublin, it was called a kringle. But on this trip, every child would bring along a red hard-boiled egg. To obtain the color, by the way, the egg was boiled in water with onion peels. Now, you might think the Christians had a monopoly on colorful Easter eggs, but in fact, Orthodox Jews and Hasidic Jews had their own springtime dyed egg traditions as well. Each child also received a few small coins on Lag BaOmer. The instructor would hire a horse carriage. He'd load the children on it and stand on one side of the carriage, while the teacher's assistant stood on the other in order to watch the children on the crowded carriage to make sure they wouldn't fall from it. The children would leave town, travel out to a park in the countryside or some fields in the countryside, and there they ate their eggs, they spent some time playing, and returned to the city. In Stern's description of Tisha B'Av, he writes how in that town preparation for Lag BaOmer began a few weeks beforehand. The helpers and the older boys would carve makeshift bows and arrows. And there, Lag BaOmer meant only a half day in the Kheyder. In the afternoon, the children would run around the small town and shout and compete with each other to shoot arrows all around. I have to assume safety standards were laxer in those days. In any case, I share these stories to emphasize that despite the dour faces we see in some of these photos, education was meant to be about joy as much as about learning. The alley, here it is again, included a few poor shops without numbers or signs, dark niches making it hard to know what they contained from the outside. In these shops, one would find a barrel of herring, some loaves of bread, a sack of flour, some liters of sugar, and a little kerosene. In one special place, one might find cakes and all kinds of sweets laid out on tins. These shops made their living from what the children from the Kheyders would buy with their coins. But the poor shopkeepers had competition from the wives of the instructors, who themselves would try to lure the children to buy from the women instead of the poor shopkeepers. It's not easy to make a living. Outside of this, there stood on the side of the alley tables on which there were some sweets and cakes. And from here, also the only buyers were the Kheyder children. As a rule, it has to be said that the studies took place in one big room. In one corner, the instructor sat with one group of kids. In the other corner sat the teacher's assistant. The room also contained a few tables and benches for children. On the wall, there would be the license of the school inspector authorizing the Kheyder, and also during the years about 120 years ago when he was head of Russia, the picture of Tsar Nicholas II on the wall. Several times a month, a teacher would come to the Kheyder to teach Russian language. It was required by the Tsar. In these lessons, the children learned to sing the Russian anthem and the honorary titles of the Tsar and his family. Each time the inspector would visit the Kheyder, the Malabed and the children would recite out loud in unison the honorary titles, and they broke out singing the Russian anthem. This was the essence of the test for the children to show that they were learning about Russia. Before Passover, the teaching assistants would engage in very honored work. Pairs of teaching assistants from the different Kheyders visited the housewives in town and brought with them mortars and pestles in order to grind the matzot to flour and crumbs to make matzah meal. This work was done in the evenings after the learning in the Kheyder. It was a long day's work for these assistants. The housewives would set aside a special room in their homes where no chametz, no leavened food material could be found. The young men were, of course, paid for this work. My grandfather wrote about there was a special entrance from the alley to the courtyard of the rabbi of Lublin, Rabbi Eiger. This red block shows where he lived. In this courtyard was a new Beit Midrash, a house of learning, and also his house. During the holidays, particularly Rosh Hashanah, this is the same street with the Kheyders. During the holidays on Rosh Hashanah and Shavuot, particularly when Hasidim in the hundreds would come to visit from the neighboring villages, they would camp there in the alley if they couldn't afford hotels in town. Many residents would turn their homes into hostels. For Hasidim, this was the cheapest place to stay, and also special because it was close to the rabbi's Beit Midrash. On these special occasions, the alley was vibrantly alive with numerous Hasidim, all dressed in their fineries and their streimlach, their fur hats on their heads. And the atmosphere was festive most of the entire year. Well, are those people gone forever? Well, yes, irretrievably yes, along with the 90% of Polish Jewry murdered during the years of the Shoah and the tremendous numbers murdered elsewhere in East Europe. Here is a photo showing where the Beit Midrash and the rabbi's home were where they had been back before the war. It's now just an empty space today. This is that same castle I showed you in Lublin. But I share you this composite photo because this, the fact is that it continues. It continues. What was once in East Europe is still true in parts of New York, elsewhere in the United States, Bnei Brak, New Jersey today. This is a street, the main street of Lublin, Grodska Street, Town Street, a photo from about 1920. You can see a bunch of Jewish boys here. Here's a typical Polish woman on this street. And what has happened is that despite the past, if I superimpose on that a picture from 1993, and it looks no different today, this is the old photo superimposed on the new, it's still the same. So the people are not here the way they once were. But in Bnei Brak, their descendants, the survivors, the children of the few who survived, the life continues in remarkable continuity. This photo shows Rabbi Pincha Moshe Taub at the completion of the writing and the dedication of a new Torah. And a Torah dedication ceremony is a very special thing. And I would argue that is important, and perhaps more important for the community is not just the rabbi filling in the last letter on the Torah, but as the Torah is being celebrated, it's carried through the streets, and it is the children who are singing and dancing. And this is a photo from the ceremony accompanying this dedication of the Torah in joyous celebration. And this is in modern times. This old map again shows us Nadstavna Street, Gesl, the alley. And even if the buildings are gone, the basic street is still there and called Furmanska. Urban renewal of crumbling buildings has erased the buildings. Intentional forgetting has removed the presence of the signs that would tell you what's actually there. But this street, which as you see in this Google photo, is still there. It looks, at least when I look at it, it looks like a haunted street in some ways, lacking any sign of real life, just empty cars. This was the alley. But I would argue, and I expect that few of us have ever walked down the street, and few of you have probably ever taken the time to walk down the street where the Kheyders were in your ancestral home, but I encourage you to do that. Why do I insist that this street, whether it's in Lublin or any town in Europe, the street where the Kheyders were, was the true heart of the Jewish community, not the street where the bankers lived, not the street where the Boilermakers had their factories, not the street where all the shopkeepers were, but the street where the Kheyders were. I would argue that the alley and its equivalent is the heart of a living Jewish community. It's not a synagogue, it's not a commercial center, and it's not even the cemetery, holy as that land is. The heart of a living Jewish community, I believe, exists especially in one place, where the children learn, where the children play. It was on Nadstavna Street in Gesl in Lublin that the children, all the Jewish boys and all the girls once learned their Aleph Bet, the Hebrew alphabet, and had their first Kheyders. Even if they weren't from Hasidic families, and even if they didn't end up choosing or following an intense religious life as did the Hasidim, they would grow up having learned the basics of Hebrew, of singing, of prayer, and of Torah, and they would find their pathway in life, whatever that was. It was on these alleys, on these streets that still exist today and are haunted with memories, yet without a sign, without a clue, that children once learned there and children once played. But you, my friends, from across the world who tuned in today, you know what was once there, and your heart can take you there. And if you're fortunate enough, if peace permits, if circumstances permits, you can still travel there. I hope you will visit there and find the traces, find the locations of those streets that are still there, at least in our imagination and under the pavement. And perhaps if you're lucky, if the wind on the day that you visit there blows the right way, perhaps you will hear the echoes of the children learning the Aleph Beis. What I shared with you is based on an article written by my grandfather, also much from an article by Achiel Stern, from the Evo Encyclopedia of Eastern Europe, other sources. But
Looks like it turned off, Dan.
okay, and I have one concluding. I will just finish on what I hope will be a positive note. And the positive note is, give me 1 second. Give me one more second. Here's the positive note. Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much. Let's see, my camera is here. We do have some questions in the Q&A. I think it's probably easier if you look through them and just pull out the ones that would be applicable to the broader audience.
Okay, let me pull up. Okay. How do you spell cadastral map? It's spelled, and actually I'll even answer a different question. I mean, there's also the question, how do you spell Kheyder? I mean, to spell it correctly, it's Chet Daled Resh. You can transliterate it in different ways, either H-E-D-E-R or K-H-E-D-E-R. But D. Seligman asks, how do you spell cadastral? The proper spelling, which I think I can put into the chat, is C-A-D-A-S-T-R-A-L. These are wonderful resources. Jay Osborne is a hero of the world who has made tons of these available through the Gesl Galicia group. Others are available for other towns. Cadastral maps were especially popular in areas of Galicia, but were also used in other towns, for example, Lublin, which was not Galicia. And if in a vital record, you see so-and-so lived in house number 407, if you find a cadastral map that refers to house numbers, it can help you figure out exactly where someone lived or where a relative lived. Let's see. Judith Solomon thought that in the very first picture of the Kheyder, there is a girl present. Let's see. Let's see if I can pull that up. I will share it with you, and then we can all decide that. Here we go. There's the screen. And do you see the screen now?
No.
No. Okay. Well, I'll have to look at that later, and I will get back to that. So what about, Susan Gold, what about the myths about the Melamed covering letters with honey and learning being associated with sweetness? I think I mentioned, I know about that for the first letter, for the very first learning. So I think there's enough people who have shared that myth that it's probably true. Let's see. Nancy S. says, how to find information about her Kheyder from Radziwiłło, Poland. The two places I'd suggest going to first might be, I'll give you a list of a few. The Yizkor book for that town. Find the book in Hebrew of Encyclopaedia Galuyot. See if there's written anything about the Kheyder from there. It's a small town, so it might not have. So the Yizkor book would be the best thing. Another idea would be to contact the JRI Poland town leader for that town and email him or her and see if they have ever come across any such information on that. Any thoughts as to why writing was not taught in Kheyder? So again, that goes back before the 19th century. I don't have a particular speculation on that. It's a good question. Did the Kheyders teach lay subjects such as foreign language? The traditional Kheyders did not. They taught really Jewish subjects, and then when they had to, they would teach information about the local government. Now, by the time of the 20th century, as parents started demanding better education in broad areas, Kheyders started to introduce sometimes additional subjects to a limited degree. As I noted, though, the Kheyders only, kids would often only be in Kheyders for 4 to 6 years, maybe 9 years at most. So kids who needed education in other fields would also get them after they left Kheyder from one place or another, or from the home. What percentage of Jews that attended schools that were not Jewish? So much of this depends, it varies by town, and it varies by era. I would say before the 19th century, almost all attended Jewish schools. By the 20th century, though, there were lots of different situations that were undertaken. For example, my mother, who lived in Lublin and was a child there in the 1930s, and came from an Orthodox home. We would call it a modern Orthodox in today's terminology. She was not unusual in that she and many of her Jewish friends attended a Catholic-run school in the morning where they had their secular classes and learned Polish, and then attended a Jewish school in the afternoon where they got their Jewish education. Marcia Ramey talks about her grandparents who were Ger Hasidim, and his Kheyder was a small one associated with the shtibel rather than a big Talmud Torah open to everyone. Again, I think, in the small, almost anything you can imagine was possible. And if you consider, I don't know how many Jewish towns the JewishGen Communities database has for Eastern Europe, but surely there are thousands. So probably each town has its own slight difference and pattern. What flags would have been distributed at Simchat Torah before the State of Israel and the modern flag? Well, certainly in the 20th century, it could have been a variation of the modern State of Israel flag, because the symbol of the Magen David was used before that. How did children get secular education? Polish, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Certainly Polish language for many people, Polish was the language of the marketplace. So in most of the countries, most of the Jews to function, since Jews were not always the farmers, most of the Jews had some basic level of the local language. In Poland, it was famous because Poles said that Jews spoke Polish with a Jewish accent rather than a Polish accent, but they still knew Polish. In writing and arithmetic, they would probably learn from home, or learn if they went into a business where they would need that, learn as apprentices in that business. Nancy asked where to find cadastral maps. Gesl Galicia is a great location for them. They have a map room in there that I refer people to. Let's see, another question. Sorrel Kerbel writes about his father having been a brilliant boy who was allowed to study at Telz. I think that education was so valued. I mean, we used to be called the people of the book. I don't know if enough of us still read books enough to merit that title. We still have the good book, the Tanakh, that is our basic book, but certainly, learning education was valued, and kids who were considered to be bright or brilliant, like Annie Louie, if the parents could afford it, or if money could be found, they would try and get the very best education possible for the slide. Aviva asks the link of Eufen Pripyatchik. If you just Google it, you can find several different links to the singing of Eufen Pripyatchik. How different were Kheyders and the shtetls? I'm sure that in the shtetls, there were, Lublin was a big city, so just like, you could go to many different grocery stores if you want in Lublin, you could pick your favorite. There were probably far fewer options in the small towns. How do you find the streets like that in other towns and cities? In Galicia, most of the towns do have cadastral maps. Sometimes it takes going into the town hall and trying to find a sympathetic person there to work with you to see if they can be found. It's not easy, but again, I would start with, for whatever country you come from, speak to one of the JewishGen research coordinators for that country or that town, and they are the ones who are most likely to know, have the best chance of knowing what resources are available in that particular city. Jeanette asks, last one asks, how, maybe I'll take this as a last question, how I believe learning disabilities, ADD, in particular dyslexia, may have been handled or perceived in the Kheyders of our ancestors. I think that our appreciation for these kind of learning difficulties has grown a tremendous amount even over the last 50 years, not just the last 100 years. So I think probably those kind of challenges were not handled or perceived so well, so that a child would more likely spent more time outdoor playing, less time indoor learning, more time doing chores, although sometimes could be found to do a job in the classroom that might be valuable in another way. But I would like to think that our generation is much more sensitive to these issues than our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents' generations. And I'm sure, and God willing, our children's and grandchildren's generations will be all the more attuned to the challenges of life than even we are today.
Thank you, Dr. Oren. This was so informative and fascinating and inspirational, and we really appreciate your time today and how much time and effort obviously went into organizing this program. We really appreciate it. We will take a break next week in terms of our Jewish Gen Talk programming, and our next webinar will take place on January 11th. Our speaker will be Lee Dworkin, and the topic will be using US genealogy to break through Polish Great Walls. I encourage everybody to join us for that important presentation by also one of the leaders in the field. Two more notes. First, we are very proud to announce that JewishGen will once again be offering a summer fellowship program whereby we take undergraduate university students and train them to be future leaders in Jewish genealogy. You can visit JewishGen.org/fellowship. That's JewishGen.org/fellowship to learn more. And note that we will also be running a similar program for those out of school, and we will be sending information about that within the next couple of weeks. We are in partnership with Dr. Oren and the Matseva Foundation, and this is really a wonderful program. This will be our third year that we're running the fellowship, and you can visit the website JewishGen.org/fellowship, and you can see photos from previous years and learn more about it. And if you have any questions, of course, you can please feel free to reach out. Finally, I'd like to make a personal request on behalf of JewishGen. If you are on this webinar, then you have benefited from one of the many, many resources that JewishGen has to offer. And as one volunteer said a few years ago on a video, JewishGen is home for many. It is a community of like-minded individuals where you can connect with family, you can learn about family, you can gain more understanding about what it means to be part of the Jewish community. And simply put, I believe that JewishGen is one of the most critical resources for Jewish genealogy, and that a proper search of your family cannot happen without it. What you may not realize is that JewishGen is largely volunteer driven. It's fueled by devoted individuals who care about our mission and are willing to put in a tremendous amount of time and effort each week, each day, to helping others, and specifically the thousands of people who are searching our website every day and even more around the time of the holidays. For these reasons, your support of Jewish Gen at this time of the year, which is so critically important and sets the tone for what we can accomplish in the next year, would really mean a lot. And your support would directly help us achieve our mission, which ultimately benefits you. A gift of any amount will make a real difference. And I thank you in advance for your support. We will include a link to donate in our follow-up email, which will also include a survey, which I hope you will please fill out. But if you can, please visit JewishGen.org. Right now, you can make an easy donation online on our secure website. A gift of any amount will really make a true difference. If you'd like to speak to me about what Jewish Gen has accomplished this past year, what we're working on, if you have any questions about the organization, I'd be glad to speak to you. Please email me at agroll@JewishGen.org. That's AGROLL at JewishGen.org. And I would be glad to speak to you further. And I thank you very, very much in advance for your support. Thank you again, Dr. Oren, to everyone who joined us today from around the world. I wish you all a very happy and healthy new year, a happy and healthy 2023, and a wonderful year ahead, and look forward to seeing you all around the Jewish Gen community. Have a great day, everyone. For everyone who is still online, we're just logging off in a second. I see someone asked a question, is the chat available? I'll leave it open for a minute. You can do a Control-A to highlight everything, and then Control-C to copy, and you can paste that onto your to a Word document. I'll leave it open for a minute so you can do that. Okay. I hope everyone was able to get that. I'm going to log off now. Can you share the email again? My email, Aviva, is that what you're asking for? Well, if you're asking for my email, it's agroll@JewishGen.org. So it's my first initial and my last name, AGROLL@JewishGen.org. I will put this in chat. The email for Dr. Oren is, I think he posted it here. The email for Dr. Oren is I don't remember it offhand, but if you want, oh, here we go. It's info@JewishHeritagePoland.org. So I'm going to post that in the chat again. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.